Welcome to Flat Earth Debate Live. I'm your host, Nathan Oakley, and if you are new to this channel, or you've not done so already, then be sure to subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, and join button if you'd like to become a Nathan Oakley 1980 channel member and keep up to date with the Flat Earth Debate. If you would like to support the channel, there is a super chat that runs alongside each of these shows while they are live, and there's also a PayPal, Patreon and crypto link in the info box below the video. Most importantly, if you'd like to join the discussion, simply mute the page you are currently watching, then click the link in the info box below this video to join the panel and express your views on the nature of Earth. If you do join, please don't swear. If you do, you'll be ejected. And if you are, please don't try to rejoin the stream using sock accounts. You'll be warmly welcome back on the next stream. Please also share the show on social media. Sharing the show obviously increases the live audience, but this in turn increases the chances of a more diverse panel, so please share the show on Facebook and Twitter. Now, we are joined by Neil, 10th Man, Refracted Curvature, Eli, Chocolate Saiyan, and a whole bunch of people in Discord, so welcome one and all.
How is it going today?
It is going great today.
It is indeed going great today.
Hey.
Yeah, I'm in a very good mood.
Friday, yeah.
Show's functioning beautifully, streaming live. It hasn't cut me off in the middle of the pre-show. Happy days all round, really. I'm just elated that my computer works. You don't know how big a load off it is when things work rather than die when you want them to work, and you have to spend 15 minutes setting the entire show up again. Anyway, is there any evidence that you can acquire an elevation angle, otherwise known as an altitude angle, from a curved baseline?
That's a joke.
Impossible.
Not in AutoCAD.
Syntax error. I know it's not syntax error, but I like saying it. It's like an old 1980s Al Computing BBCB reference. Syntax error. Any evidence of a physical geometric sphere edge horizon formerly known as the curve of the Earth?
Just to clear it up, is that the one that we expect to see or the one that we wouldn't expect to see?
Well, we covered a bit of
Even
this in
though
the
it's-
pre-show before you got here, actually, Chocolate. I know you can't see this, but for the audience's benefit, we talked about a few different horizons. So when they're talking about acquisition of an angle measurement from a flat plane, in this diagram from 10th Man, HO, they also simultaneously have a second tangent point horizon, which we're talking about at the moment, formerly known as Earth curve horizon, in this dip claim, marked as H apostrophe, and your line to it being from O apostrophe to H apostrophe. So that's one horizon, the tangent point we debunked in 2020 with the Black Swan. And then you add on top of that your Globeburger / Dingleberry Earth, and that's got a further 3 horizons. So you've got sensible horizon, geoidal horizon, and celestial horizon. Well, you couple that with the tangent point horizon for a total of 4 globe Earth horizons. Any comment?
I mean, that's a hell of a thing, because whenever I've used my eyes and gone out and looked, I've only seen one.
Well, that's
Where are
correct,
the other
Chocolate.
3 or 4?
We've only got one horizon. It's just the horizon in the begging the question proof of nothing perspective hijacking Earth curve calculator would be a tangent point to a physical leading edge of a sphere we debunked in 2020. The horizon we see, on the other hand, is merely the demarcation between ground and sky at any distance where you can see it. Well, in this, that would be your sensible horizon in a sextant with a bubble in it, in other words, an artificial horizon that just meets your eye line, or the geoidal surface in Muppet Vision, because it's not showing you your line of sight, it's just showing you lines that represent parallel with the flat plane you're actually standing on, and will be using if you're navigating, transposed down to the centre of the celestial horizon to give you a protractor over a flat plane. That's all this blue bit is, nothing to do with the globe Earth. It's just representative of the celestial sphere model, which has a flat plane at its centre. And this is just your protractor, all 360 degrees of it, or 180 if you cut it in half.
Big dip, then.
What, sorry?
So not a geometric dip then.
No, there is no geometric horizon to correct for in terms of dip. It's just Al-Biruni called his acquisition of the geometric horizon to derive an R value a dip measurement. So they've taken height of eye correction in celestial navigation and just bastardized it, morphed it with the Al-Biruni dip measurement and called it the same, meaning you've strapped another horizon onto the 3 existing ones.
Sons of bitches.
Indeed. That's right, they are sons of bitches. Not that anybody in particular has done this, Neil. I mean, I'm sure you could actually tie it back to one individual who was led to believe he was on a sphere and thought he was doing great, like Andrew Thomas Young in the most recent examples we can give. Well, I'm sure he's not actually out to deceive people. He probably thought he was doing a really great job explaining why we don't have a geometric horizon with atmosphere, sphere-shaped air, bending light at a standard rate derived from the R value that Al-Biruni can no longer measure if Andrew Thomas Young bends that light out of sight. Further to that, you can no longer acquire angle measurements if the lines that you're claiming to cite are bent, as they are claimed to be by globe believers, including but not limited to Simon Dan, Craig, Fight the Flat Earth, and Mr. Sensible. If you're a member, in the next hour or so, I've uploaded a trimmed out video from yesterday's after show. So if you did watch yesterday's after show as a member in its entirety, you'll know what I'm talking about, but I've edited down a section of that which is calling out those exact idiots, because when we discuss celestial navigation here and angles, they're going to be straight lines that we're dealing with. And ultimately speaking, they are something that you cannot acquire, especially if you've made declarations as Simon Dan, Fight the Flat Earth, and Mr. Sensible have made, that you're never going to get any straight lines. Every line of sight to everything ever is always bent, screwing you completely if you need to make a straight line angle measurement. And as we had yesterday with Virus telling us all about this, you end up in a position where you have to deny your own rhetoric that you've been barking at us for 2 straight years in terms of refracted horizons.
Well, I just want to remind everybody the sextant has 1 horizon there.
We've only got 1 horizon. It's just not Earth curve. Who was that from Discord? Go ahead.
Well, it was me, but I was just was looking for AI. I don't think AI is in the server right now, but he was talking about this some government entity that tested refraction specifically using different wavelengths of light, quote unquote. And the result was that the terrestrial refraction that would have to be there to duct tape the globe just is provably not applicable. So, but I was hoping he'd be here. Give him a second.
Well, what that's doing is using an equivocation fallacy. So what's being described is refraction. Is refraction real? Yes. Can we demonstrate refraction? Yes. Is refraction terrestrial refraction? No.
Nope.
Terrestrial refraction is 7/6 of a radius value in standard format. That, in other words, is a derivative R value. Now, they can change the 7/6 bit to whatever they like, but they absolutely unequivocally require R. It's a mathematical derivation of R to assert terrestrial, that's sphere-shaped air, refraction. Well, that's not refraction. Light deviating from a straight path through a medium, or Snell's law as it traverses a different medium, that's real. You can show it. That isn't light bending through air that is sphere-shaped. That's terrestrial refraction. They may call it refraction at the end of the, whatever you call it, prefix, but it isn't. It's not refraction. It's 7/6 of a radius in standard form, or any derivative thereof, R. So you'll need R, and it's nothing to do with light.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that it's a derivative of R, because R is a derivative from a flat plane.
Indeed. So that's when you get down to the nitty-gritty of what refraction actually takes place in the air, not atmosphere. And that would be a negligible amount.
Do we have sphere-shaped air?
That's an oxymoron. Air takes the shape of its container. It's a gas. So the air we breathe, which is a mixture of various gases, does the same. It just takes the shape of its container. To assert that it arbitrarily takes the shape of a sphere is an oxymoron. Air is not sphere-shaped. It's unbonded. It's moving at high velocities in all directions. individual particles of it, not a collection of it in a sphere shape.
Unless, of course, the container was actually spherical.
Then
But
you've got a
that's
spherical
not what they
container
claim.
with gas
They
in
don't
it.
claim that, so
Yeah, but a spherical container with gas in it is very different to saying that air arbitrarily takes the shape of a sphere by this commonly used word, atmosphere.
indeed.
Any evidence that you can have gas pressure without a container, sphere-shaped or otherwise?
There's no way to test that. We can't start out with an example in order to test that.
Isn't that funny that you have laws of nature talking about such effects as entropy, and when Darwin comes to describing a fundamental belief in a heliocentric world with a sky vacuum, Darwin cannot even begin to detail how that could be possible to prove. Hence, it always ends up in begging the question fallacy. Well, if the sky is a vacuum and the gas isn't filling it, then my heliocentric worldview pans out quite nicely. Now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing, so it's obvious the point that they make when they say, well, the sky is a vacuum and the gas isn't filling it. It's just begging the question. You can't even demonstrate it. You need a container just to get a vacuum. And then what are you going to do? Put a balloon in it, pop it, and hope that it stays in a sphere shape? It's just absurd. Even if you did, we'd say, well, you've got a vacuum that's got a container to achieve it.
Right, and the thing about actual vacuums as we create them using containers is that they tend to, well, destabilize the amount of gas and what it does within the space that it gets involved with, right? Well, guess what's out here? It's stable gas. The pressure is stable. It's not changing rapidly in one direction. And that's what we get to see every time we start to do tests where vacuum gets involved, right? It doesn't stay stable when low pressure situations get involved with regular pressure from gas. The gas doesn't stay stable. It depressurizes and then it forms a new pressure, unless it just keeps getting vacuumed out. So that doesn't happen out here. So it's not an open system.
Any evidence?
Well, I can't.
Oh, go on. If there's more to this, go ahead.
Well, I can't prove it to you, but I can tell you how you have to think about it if you want to believe the sky is a vacuum.
Can't we all by now?
Uh,
Century of open containment belief.
I'm just trying to
that
think
yields
back
a whole
to...
bunch of grassroots opinions on how it could be like that.
Well, I was just trying to think of a way that would sandwich into John's only two rebuttals were he to ever debate Kent Hovind or Professor Phil Bell, which is to say one of the replies is you'll need a flat plane for that, and the other is that violates the celestial sphere model. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, the assertion that you've just alluded to, John, would require sphere-shaped air. And for it to be sphere-shaped air, it's going to need a radius. And if it's going to need a radius, it's going to need a flat plane to get it. So therefore, it's not a violation of the celestial sphere model. It's more you're going to need a flat plane to get to your sphere-shaped air. Am I wrong?
Wow.
Well, yeah, it's the assertion will come with their positive claim of atmosphere. That's when they'll run into problems.
Well, that's what I'm saying. At the point that they say atmosphere, sphere-shaped air.
Can I conclude from this that you can't get a radius value without a flat plane?
That's correct, Darwin. That's how they measured it.
That's tragic.
It is, isn't it? Isn't it beautiful? I like how you, Baldwin, I'll say, use the word tragic when you talk about... I know from a flat Earth perspective it's still tragic in an ironic way, but it is literally tragic. Yeah, your globe was taking flat Earth measurements to make it. Yeah, how tragic for you. How joyous for me, because it makes me an expert in that particular field, because suddenly there's a parallel between the information I understand about the flat plane and the heliocentric model that I used to ascribe to. Well, one is very much tied to the other now, isn't it? So where's your next level of expertise in heliocentrism, if you want to believe in that religion, going to come from? Well, people who know the root origins of it. Us, flat earthers, that's who. Because that's where your model came from.
Well, I could play virus now and say I'd like to see how you came up with the sphere from a flat Earth measurements?
I would love to demonstrate it in my kitchen.
I told him when he asked, I said it was elevation angle measurements to Polaris to get to your dual radii.
Did that already. Doesn't work out.
Do you want to explain that, Brian? Hey, by the way.
Hey Nathan, hey everyone. What is it you want me to explain?
How you get to a globe from acquisition of elevation angle measurements to Polaris.
Well, yeah, you have to hijack perspective. Perspective of what we see in frontal view. You take elevation angles to Polaris as you move back away from having Polaris at your 90 degrees. You need a horizontal baseline to go from your position to the GP of Polaris all the time. And the length of that horizontal will be changing, getting longer and longer as you move away from Polaris. So it can't be done without a flat plane. So
look a diagram up of exactly that. So when I was saying earlier that the is bifurcation the right word? Cutting in half of the protractor, this blue area, and calling it a celestial horizon, i.e. the flat plane that you're standing on. And then when you're measuring out to the sky, so if you ignore the labels on this diagram and just have this top line as the sky, then the star is going to get further away from your vantage point as it recedes towards the horizon. That looks something like this. So there's, I know it's pictures of the sun, but if you say it's Polaris, it makes no difference. As you back away from it, it'll recede towards the horizon. So you're taking an angle measurement to depict that. Well, the angle itself has come off a flat plane, but the tool that was used was how the globe was created, because they've then taken the arc of the tool and called it the surface of the ground that you were standing on at the centre of the tool when you were holding a sextant or a protractor in this instance, and measuring things with perspective, as Brian's just detailed, receding towards the horizon. In an orthographic representation, this is how that would look. From your perspective, you just see it going lower to the ground, or, obviously, further around this protractor, changing the angle measurement to it. But every one of those descriptions requires that you've got a flat baseline. This 0 to 180 degree line along the bottom of the tool, that's for flat Earth proof, right there. But they've hijacked perspective. Exactly, Brian. You are far more succinct than I.
Oh no, that's not really, Nathan. Not really. We just explained it a little bit slightly differently. The vertex is always going to be on the surface of the water as they move away from Polaris. They'll have the vertex, at sea level, vertex of the angle. So they'll be using the surface of Earth all the time, and that means the surface of Earth has to be flat because the baseline, the adjacent of the triangle, will be always a horizontal. So if they've got a 45-degree angle, that's 2,700 nautical miles of a horizontal baseline that they'll be using from their position to the GP of Polaris. And the vertex of that angle will be on the surface of Earth. So that means the surface of Earth also has to be flat. That's where they get their dual radii from, because their globe has to match what we see in the sky, has to match the stars, it has to match all that. And it can only match that if it matches. It can only match. What I mean is that it can't change any of the radii, the polar or equatorial radii of the globe. They have to stay exactly as they are. Because if they try to change them, that would mean changing the angle to Polaris. If you know what I mean, that would change the angles to Polaris, and that would mean changing reality, which you can't.
And when you say the globe, in reality, you're saying the centre of the protractor that you're using to measure, because that's working off the equatorial plane at the centre of a depiction that sometimes has a globe in it, but is actually representing the sky as a celestial sphere. So you've got a celestial horizon in that description with their equatorial plane. Well, the equatorial plane is just a protractor sat over the top of you, showing your perspective view of the world that's flat with a flat sky.
Yeah, it's just a back engineering of a flat plane. That's all it is. Back engineering of a flat plane using perspective. Just mathematical back engineering. That's where they got their dual radii from.
Yeah, it was always down to perspective. It's amazing that we got closer and closer to it. So originally, when we were talking about Earth curve and the physical geometric sphere edge horizon that used to block boats and buildings and is now refracted, meaning they can't measure angles because of atmosphere, just to bring us up to where we're talking about now. We originally said that they were excluding perspective from the curve maths. So you haven't included the fact that things get smaller into the distance. And that's exemplified by, or exampled by, the feet and inches or meters value that ascribes itself to the targets in those maths. So if you look at a building that's, I don't know, 10 miles away, they'll say, well, it's a 200-foot building, right? There's 10 feet of it missing, or there's 100 feet of it missing. Whatever's missing, they'll ascribe in feet, when in reality something that's 10 miles away has an angular size reduction. So originally we said, well, you need to account for both. Anthony called it a double dip. But then after a period of time when QE had pointed out the linear perspective relationship that only occurs as you look out on a clear day, that means that the representation that they've given you of 8 inches per mile squared, that squared function of curvature, represents itself closely, but not exactly, to the linear perspective relationship we actually see. And up to about, I think it's 1,000 miles, you couldn't tell the difference. So they've hijacked linear perspective and called it square function curvature into the distance at a geometric point that blocks your view. Obviously ruined by the black swan. But that was the point that we changed from you've excluded perspective in your Earth curve maths to you've hijacked perspective. Hence the name is now, flows off my tongue so easily because I've said it so many times. But the begging the question, proof of nothing, perspective hijacking Earth curve calculator. Well, you can take that one step further now based on what we're talking about today, which is to say that the Earth curve calculator itself is a hijacking of perspective when you talk about the Earth curve, because the Earth curve is actually the outside edge of the protractor used to measure the angles to the stars off a flat plane. So the calculation itself not only requires a flat plane, but also violates the celestial sphere model, because you can't acquire altitude angles to the very derivative star that got you your radius and your sphere model when hijacking the outside edge of a protractor.
Yeah, I mean, the Earth curve calculator is just a perspective and a refractive measurement tool. That's all it is, isn't it? It just amalgamated the two of them and made a way of kind of a way of measuring or something.
Oh, absolutely. I remember Flat Earth Data coming in. He got shouted down by QE. I'll never forget this because he was reading off the manual and describing some part of it that we'd debunked in terms of globe claims. But he was desperately trying to point out, no, look, what they're describing here with similar mathematics, or not similar, let's get it right, the same mathematics as Earth curve / what do they call it? They just call it Earth curve maths. Well, he's showing that the same exact maths representing the horizon as a physical leading edge of a sphere is being detailed as a horizon, but with absolutely no reference whatsoever back in 18 whatever it was, back in the early 19th century. They're talking about this exact maths. It just is an Earth curve.
Yeah, it's not Earth curve. I mean, even angular size change is only a measurement within perspective. And that is not the whole of perspective. It's just one function of perspective. I mean, just because a mountain has a particular angular size at a distance doesn't mean you're always going to see that mountain or that object at that size, at that distance. The angular size measurement of it is just a calculation based on its actual height. But it's just a calculation. It's not a measurement. The angular size is never an actual measurement. It's always just a calculation. That's why something in the distance can appear bigger or smaller depending on the day. Higher or lower, I should say, if you know what I mean.
Exactly, well, but there's something in the distance in terms of the physical object description gets overridden by the fact that the model used to give that target description in the maths is a globe, and the globe itself is a derivative of the tool. So perspective, as you started this conversation off, Brian, isn't just the hijacking of what we see, it's the hijacking and then creation from what we see, measured on a plane, into the globe that's then used to hijack perspective to represent you stood on the top of the tool in orthographic view, because that's all Muppet Vision maths in Earth curve terms is. You stood on top of a protractor.
Yeah, recently... Sorry, Arvin, you go ahead. I say after.
I just wanted to say, I think it was blanked out through Nathan's sound system, but like when they do the curvature calculation and all that about supposed heights of mountains and what it would be like at a height, well, the thing is that's not related to what you're actually observing. So information is supposedly derived from perspective applied views, but then the calculation that is done is basically orthographic. It's the actual size. None of that end result of that calculation actually applies to your sight. And that's the entire trick.
Exactly. So you've hijacked perspective to get from flat plane to R value based, what I'm calling the protractor, they call the globe. And then from that to back to the perspective view being hijacked to represent that transposition from flat plane elevation angle measurements to the globe, back to what you see in reality described as being on a globe. So there's two levels of perspective hijacking. One to get from the plane to the globe, and another to get back from the globe to the plane you observe. I mean, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You'd have to go one way and then back the other when you represent it. And that sort of transposition goes from the centre of a presupposed spherical Earth as the viewing point for your celestial dome, and then back up to the top of the protractor when you stood on it using the curve maths. So the level of perspective hijacking has just been detailed at one extra level. And the only person who's come close to describing this so far is John, Refracted Curvature, when he was talking about the same thing, but he was saying when you take a Muppet Vision representation of it in the first level, and then you add on to it another Muppet Vision perspective view hijacked of that Muppet view, of that orthographic view that you started with. It's getting a bit confusing. But John did a much better explanation, but he just used Muppet Vision instead of perspective. Do you remember, John?
Can I make it?
Yeah, that's...
Oh, hold on, Alwyn.
Talking about the Earth... You're talking about the Earth curve calculator. Sorry, I had to step away for a minute.
Well, what I'm talking about is when you described how you go from, with your kitchen maths, a flat plane, to the sphere model itself. We're now taking it from that, which is a perspective hijacking that Brian started this whole conversation with describing. Well, that perspective hijacking is very different to the perspective we see in reality being called Earth curve. So what I'm trying to get across to you, so that you can say, no, when I described it, I talked about it in being an orthographic representation of an orthographic representation. Well, what is an orthographic representation? Well, it's a hijacking of perspective. It just goes in two directions. The first direction is from the plane we're standing on taking measurements to the globe model. So that's the first perspective hijacking, using the Polaris dropping towards the horizon as you move away from it on a plane measuring angles to it. That gets you to your globe with your dual radii. Well, from there, you've then got to say, well, with this model, we've still got to represent how the world actually presents itself. Well, we'll do that with another layer of perspective hijacking that works in the other direction. And that's the curve maths.
Right? It's to orthographic view and back again.
Yeah, well put. Oh, Arwyn, you're on fire. To orthographic view and back again. Exactly.
I recently did a video, the most recent video I did. And what I did is in orthographic view, I made things start changing in angular size. And the opposition are absolutely livid over it. It's like I made it about 3 weeks ago, and I'm still getting comments up to today on it. And most of them just want to correct me on something that's a total straw man, on something that doesn't need correction. Because either they don't understand or they're just being dishonest, whichever. But the whole point of what I was doing was trying to show how using angular size, I was using the Blackpool tower tower and mountain picture, I was showing, due to using angular size and an observer's position, that what the effect of visual occultation does. Because they never want to deal with this effect, because that effect causes something that's much larger in the background to appear much lower in relation to something that's smaller in the foreground. They don't want to deal with that, because that's an admittance that means they have to then go and show that in their globe maps that they can't.
Can you just cup your mic? Brian, we can hardly make out what you said. Just cup your mic.
Sorry,
like,
step inside. Yeah.
Cup your mic, like put your hand around it.
I'm inside now. I'm inside. Sorry.
Oh, right, okay. Well, that's even better.
But yeah, but the whole point of what I showed, why I was showing things changing in angular size orthographically, was to show what would happen with the effect of visual occultation, which causes something much larger in the background to appear to be much lower than something that's smaller than it in the foreground. But the foreground object is either of equal size or higher, equal height or higher than the observer's eyes. So what happens is you have this kind of like a dropping effect to the larger object in the background. You see it all the time in places like Manhattan, where you have buildings that are twice the height of another building, only a mile behind it. And because of your position, that big building is way lower. I tried to show this orthographically because they want, what they've, and this is Ruhiv trying to argue for, is that orthographic view does take in perspective. That's what they're trying to argue, because they need it to, because they are latching onto a globe model, an orthographic view, where there is no perspective added in. And they're trying to add in, they're trying to say that because the angle to the top of an object changes as you move back away from it, or move to, let's say, away from it orthographically, that means there's an angular size change happening. But there isn't an angular size change happening in orthographic view. Orthographic view doesn't exist in reality outside of a computer screen or a blank piece of paper. It's purely a conceptual thing. We don't view anything orthographically. We view everything in perspective view. And that is what they've hijacked. But the effect of visual occultation, they cannot address that, and they will not address that. They have never addressed it in all the years I've talked about it. That's been 5 or 6 years I've talked about that particular effect. They won't address it. Why won't you address it? Because it means an admittance that it's perspective and not out globe rotate or out curvature.
It always was. It always was perspective. Shout out to the over 100 people watching the show. Woo-hoo-hoo! Please share the show. And a very warm welcome to all of you who've just joined us. If you have shared the show already, thank you very much indeed. If you haven't, please smash the share button. That's the only reason there's over 100 people watching. So yeah, please share the show if you've not done so already. Subscribe if you've not done so already. And if you're unaware, the pre and after show goes out on my second channel. So typically it's a few days delayed because the members get it early. As soon as it's recorded, you can have it if you're a member. Also, there's a member video coming out in the next hour or so, or when I finish this live stream and get to it while the after show's running. But that's basically highlighting a contradiction that the Globers now find themselves in, having spent 2 years barking refraction at us. When they need to measure angles, well, you don't use straight lines for angles. Yeah, you definitely do, don't you? So what are you going to do in sphere-shaped air? Well, you don't. It just leaves them buggered. So me pointing out that there's 3 big names, Simon Dan, Craig, Fight the Flat Earth, and Mr. Sensible, all declaring that you wouldn't expect to see a straight line to anything ever. We've got atmosphere. That causes a lot of problems when people come here and debate celestial navigation and the acquisition of 2 straight lines. So that'll go out to members today and probably to the rest of the general public over the weekend. So be here or be sphere for that. It's called Simon Dan, Craig, and Mr. Sensible's Humiliation. Check it out.
Don't bring them into the argument, because if I'm on the sphere side, then it's devastating.
Wait, Virus was trying to deny that he doesn't line up with them, correct? He was denying?
I don't know. I don't care. He's telling me that we should consider all lines straight. Line of sight is straight. What I see has just got a straight line to it. He said it in various different ways. Okay. Well, I'm afraid not. On a globe model, we've been told by some pretty heavy hitters in this arena far larger than I, how bent those lines are, haven't we, Neil? So it matters not. We know that he needs to appeal to a straight line if he's going to be measuring an angle. That just means they're all incorrect when they tell us about the assumption that this derivative R value based standardized at 7/6 of that radius value called terrestrial refraction is actually an effect we see in physical reality. It isn't, it's a mathematical derivative of R, but they have come to believe that that's the air we see. And because air is sphere-shaped, atmosphere, everything we see is always bent at a rate of R. That's their belief, and that's what they've told their audiences. Until you need to measure a straight line to something. And then, as Virus points out, I just assume that lines of sight are straight, because I'm going to be measuring an angle now. How embarrassing for all the dickheads that told us how bent it was for the last 2 years.
Yeah, I was just going to say, until you ask him, what was his response to the Black Swan? All of a sudden, we forgot that, right? That doesn't count.
Doesn't count for Rufy. Who was it that was talking about Ruhif most recently? I forget. Was it you, Brian?
I think him a lot because he keeps on being in contact. Adam, though, too, he keeps on being in contact with.
He's using straight lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he needs to take that up with Simon Dan, Craig Fight the Flat Earth, Mr. Sensible, and a whole bunch of other people who told us how bent those lines were. Now, if he's going to tell me, oh, it's okay, we account for refraction. Really, you account for refraction when bending the line that you're measuring, because your lines aren't straight to get angles from. There's no accounting for it if you can't measure it. And you're measuring two straight lines, not just slapping them down in orthographic Muppet view and saying, I've got a straight line of sight now. No, you haven't. Unlucky.
Boy, did that come back to bite them, huh?
Oh, refraction was the death the moment we declared it to them when we told them. The moment you bend the lines, you've got no straight lines for your geometry anymore. By saying refraction, you're killing your own argument. And they ignored us for 2 years. And then when it comes to them actually needing a straight line, hey, Rufy, you're getting this down, get a pen, sunshine. Suddenly, it's a big problem. 2 straight years of them declaring that they haven't got any straight lines, and we told them. They just ignored us and carried on parroting it. It was amazing. Like, the moment you say refraction, it means you haven't got any straight lines for your geometry anymore. Where are you going to get R? Or in this case, how are you going to measure an angle?
Well, it's really bad.
I do clearly remember. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's really bad because one of them says his hand isn't in front of his face.
Yeah. Go on, Chocolate.
No, because I clearly remember them telling us that it's always refracted, always bent, never straight. And yesterday, Virus clearly said it's always straight, never bent. I mean,
exactly. Never bent because he's getting a straight line angle measurement. Well, okay. No, we get straight line angle measurements off flat planes to get areas of equal elevation. None of these things are talking to spheres, by the way. They're all talking to the exact same elevation angle that was used to get an R value to claim you're on a sphere. But those don't work when you're talking about measuring angles. So if you're talking about measuring angles, the first thing you've got to do is beg the question of a plane that you're using to measure it. And you better be damn sure that you'll be measuring straight lines from that plane to eventually get to the sphere bit. I mean, that'll take some time. But first you've got to get to a flat plane with straight lines on it, because you're talking angles when you're talking navigation or the acquisition of dual radii. You'll need flat planes for all of these things. Spheres don't work out. But what's that you say? It's just okay to assume a straight line to it because angles need straight lines. No, well, you haven't got any on a globe. Yeah, talk to Craig, talk to Dan, or talk to Sensible. They'll tell you just how bent they are.
Well, see, the line they're bending, or the line that was bent, wasn't even the line they were going to acquire the angle from. That's the angle to their presupposition. Like I said, I don't know why anybody stayed a glober after the Black Swan. I don't get it.
No, you're absolutely right. You've got to get to your...
I have an alternative.
You've got to get to your globe model to presuppose that you're violating it, is John's point. So when you say you're measuring a tangent point to a sphere edge horizon with a straight line that was debunked in 2020, that sphere edge horizon on a globe model was derived from a flat plane. That's John's point.
Yeah. Sorry, can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Darwin.
Yeah, I'll go after you.
Right. Yeah, I have an alternative option to why Fight the Flat Earth thinks his hand is not actually in front of him where he sees it.
Is this going to be
could
vulgar?
Also, huh? No. I'm just saying that instead of terrestrial refraction, it could also just be that he needs new glasses.
Oh, well, that could also be true, but in terms of light traversing two different mediums, in this case air and then a piece of glass that's bent in a certain way, yeah, that I can believe. It's got a whole law attached to it. Snell's law would describe that. That is refraction. But what is described at 7/6 of a radius value in Muppet vision, bending light through sphere-shaped air? That's terrestrial refraction. Light isn't definitely bending his hand into a different non-physical position by a tiny amount because air's bent at a rate of r. Light isn't bent at a rate of r. That's only describable in Muppet vision. It definitely isn't representative of the air we're breathing and the light that we're seeing. He's just wrong. Deluded. Confused by a model that was derived from a flat plane and then described to have light bending around it. Well, he'll need an R value that came from a flat plane for the light bending also, because it's based on R that was got from a flat plane.
Well, a joke I made before, and I don't know how well it went over last time, but according to Craig McNeil, Fight the Flat Earth, and what he says about if your hand is in front of your face, it's not really where you think it is, then that would make Floyd Mayweather one of the greatest refraction masters of all time. Because how does boxing...
How does anybody fight if that's the case?
You think you're defending yourself, but your hand is not where you think it is, so you get knocked out.
They're not really getting hit,
don't descend his example into absurdium. It's true on the globe model. So what I quite like about Craig is he tends to stay in line with the actual rhetoric, the globe rhetoric. He doesn't necessarily, he does often, but not necessarily fall in line with anti-flat earth rhetoric, because he does actually know his stuff, and I can respect that. So when Craig says, my hand isn't where it's supposed to be, the first time that was explained to me, it was Chris Monk explaining it to me while we were looking at the Isle of Man models, and I was wrapping my head around it. And I was saying to him, based on what I'm understanding, the air's always there. Therefore, in the curve maths, where there's a second separate section that says refraction, that should basically always be the applicable value. This is before I realised that begging the question of a sphere-Earth horizon was going to be onto a loser in this debate. But that aside, my point being that the original geometry maths, well, you just get rid of that. You're never going to see physical geometry. You only ever see the refracted value. And Chris was like, yeah, your hand isn't... He didn't say it in these terms, but he gave me a similar example. If you looked at your hand in front of your face, you've still got sphere-shaped air between you and your hand. So to a very minuscule amount, your hand isn't where you think it is. Neither's anything, everything on a sphere model belief that you might hold about the world that you're looking at isn't really where it's supposed to be, because everything's subject to refraction. So I understood this long before Craig put his description out there of his hand not really being there, and that description is in line with heliocentric rhetoric. It's just not true because we don't see the world in Muppet vision, and light bending through sphere-shaped air is an oxymoron. Air isn't sphere-shaped, and light doesn't traverse through it at a rate of r. And the r value he's claiming atmosphere sphere-shaped air is bending the light was derived from a flat plane in the first place, making it paradoxical. So ultimately speaking, how he's describing it in line with a rhetoric that came from a flat earth to make a globe model is actually, strictly speaking, true. His hand on his globe model isn't where he thinks it is, by a very tiny amount. It's not that the boxing glove isn't going to make contact because of that, but in strictest terms, he's correct, in line with the heliocentric rhetoric. Not actually right, it's absolutely absurd. But when you get down to the minutiae, I just don't want someone to write into the comments, it doesn't mean his hand's 50 yards away. You know, no, it doesn't, I realise. At a very short distance, 7/6 is going to have a negligible amount of difference, even if you look at it in Muppet vision. But he's still, strictly speaking, saying that your hand isn't where you think it is because the light bent between where you got it and where you saw it. Well, if that's the case, you completely violate the geometry because you can't acquire it anymore. You've got no straight lines to use when you look out at anything in reality because everything's subject to 7/6 of the radius. that you can't measure anymore. The whole thing implodes.
Yeah, but that's ridiculous right from the start. Because what were they doing in wars when they had to hit ships or targets? Are you kidding me?
QE made that example 4 years ago. If refraction at 7/6 of a radius was true, then it would render the entire militaries of every country totally impotent. And Taboo Conspiracy made this example from a submarine mock-up of a periscope. And he's got one guy talking to the other guy going, how far away is that ship? That's 3 miles. Oh, well, that's definitely real then. That's all. We can see all of that. We could hit that. What about the ship beyond it? 7 miles? Touch and go. Almost refracted, hologrammatic projection, but touch and go. What about the one beyond that? The really small one? Oh, that's at 15 miles. Oh, well, that's definitely a hologram. I mean, we couldn't see it, so it's obviously not there. It's obviously a mirage. So we're definitely not going to be hitting that one at 15 miles away because we can't really see it. That would be the conversation you had if you were on a sub looking at something in the distance and accounting for the fact that you couldn't really see it because it wasn't really there because it's subject to 7/6 of a radius value, debunked in 2020.
Yeah, this 7/6R is just, that was a necessity to get them back from orthographic to perspective. Now, as you were saying earlier, like they go from perspective hijacking, so perspective view to orthographic, but then they need to get back to perspective, and that they require 7/6R for that. So that's why there's no 7/6R in, if you look at any of the orthographic depictions of the globe, there's no 7/6R in it, unless you see Rumpus's ones where he tries to put it in there. You know, there's no real 7/6R in it. They just show an orthographic geometric thing, and then they try and add in 7/6R when it comes back to reality, because reality doesn't match what they show orthographically.
Did somebody say they wanted to speak to AI Overlord? Because not AI Overlord is here, if that helps.
That was Eli.
Go, Eli, go.
Oh, my bad. I thought I was unmuted. Yeah, he was talking about refraction yesterday. I thought he could bring it up today. So, hello.
Don't know if he's listening to this conversation. I thought he would have piped up if he'd have heard you, but he hasn't. Oh, there we go.
Well, what if Earth turn is correcting?
Well, I haven't been asked a question,
refraction?
so I don't know what to talk about.
Yeah, you might want to phrase it as a question, Eli. Sorry, John.
Well, can you expand on what can you tell them what you were talking about yesterday about refraction and what the government was testing that was going on and all that with the lasers and whatnot?
Oh, yeah. So different wavelengths of light refract at different rates through the same media. So this is why we get prismatic effects. So this is validated experientially and demonstrably. So the most common rebuttal to any long distance observation, whether it be the Selenelian, laser test, the black swan, et cetera, ad infinitum, is always refraction. And this type of refraction is always modeled in some way, shape, or form, either using an Earth curve calculator or some kind of quote unquote standard model of refraction, or 7/6R, yada, 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 right? So if that was true, that you had this curvilinear rate of refraction that was ubiquitous throughout the atmosphere that solved all these problems for them, then that means that necessarily you would have some type of chromatic aberration in the final image, right? Because all the light wouldn't arrive in the same spot that it should. Now that's well and good, however, it goes further than that. So for example, the FE core laser test is 25 miles, right? The differential in the off angle from the supposed hump of Earth curve predicts a differential to the target of 90 meters, right? However, the target was hit. So that's 2 orders of magnitude differential, which in and of itself invalidates the globe proposition by direct measurement. So their only Hail Mary is, well, what if light is being curved around the Earth in this, way that matches the sphere so that it can be seen? Okay, that's a cool story. So recently, the military contracted and chartered a test of different wavelength lasers at 120 kilometers, which is obviously greater than 25 miles. And they set up an apparatus to receive the lasers. They set up the lasers, and there were 3 different color lasers. I've already set the baseline that different chroma will take a different path through the same media, right? Because they refract at different rates. That means that they can't arrive at the same place, correct? Pretty simple.
Yeah, chromatic
so what they
aberration.
Did is they did this test.
I like that.
Yep, they did this test. They did this test, right, without any preconceived notions, just trying to satisfy the military charter that they were given. Some universities, I believe Boeing was involved as well. So legit people doing legit stuff, right? Not a bunch of hacks. So they did their test and they got the results and they analyzed their results. And what they found was that their results are impossible if any standard model of refraction, which supposedly answers any of these observations or laser tests that we've done, right? It's impossible. Because all 3 lasers hit the target point in the same spot. They were not separated by the necessary separation that the globe Earth Hail Mary refraction requires. So this means by demonstrable, it's not an experiment, it's a demonstrable measurement, that the refraction that they require does not exist. So they appeal to this refraction as a post hoc answer to how the results of observations don't go their way. They then take a Earth curve calculator, right, which is a model, right, and they slide a scale on a little computer screen until it quote unquote matches. Okay, let's be clear, that is not a demonstrable, valid test in the real world. That's just a bunch of numbers on a screen. So they never had any positive proof that this refraction that they need exists, never. They always just had essentially affirming the consequent fallacies, right?
Yeah.
Now, the government, completely unrelated to the flat Earth proposition, they're just trying to measure the accuracy of lasers over distance for obvious military purposes, right? Where they need the brass tacks of the situation. And they found positive evidence that the refraction that the globers dream of when they go to sleep at night and hold their globe plushie and pet it and say, I love you, does not exist.
Right. And this is an elaboration on an example that QE made with the Sea Sparrow, where they paint the targets with lasers. Same principle, right? That wouldn't be possible. I mean, his example utilises the fact that it's beyond the geometric limitations when they're painting these targets. Painting them means putting a laser dot on it so that you can guide in something to shoot it. Well, beyond Earth curve limitations was the original argument. But now, what about the chromatic aberrations that you'd get if you had 2 different things pointing it at the same time? Well, you get a different effect based on the different rates at the different distances. In fact, you'd never get a decent photo of anything, ever. What's being described as chromatic aberration would mean your entire image in a camera shot at a long distance would be all messed up because of the different rates that the light was bending at the different distances. It's absolutely absurd.
Yeah, the Sea Sparrow missile laser, I'm feeding back on someone there. The Sea Sparrow missile laser, that always works below 100 feet. And why it does is it has 2 purposes. It's to target other ships, but it's also to target low-flying aircraft that are trying to fly below radar. So it always works below 100 feet. So it's never working above 100 feet, ever. So, and it works within, and they're painting targets, I think it was 60, was it 60 nautical miles away, or 50, well, 50 nautical, it'd be about 16?
The guy that originally disclosed this to Mark Sargent said 60 miles, and that's what's in the release to the public information. And every time it comes up, it's hinted at. Nah, it works much further than that. But we're allowed to say 60 miles.
Yeah, I mean, they'll never give you the true value because they don't want people. They don't want obviously opposition to know it. But if they say 60 nautical miles, you could speculate that it's a lot more, or 50 nautical. Sorry, you could speculate that it's a lot more than that.
But even at 60, when it was used with that the Type 2 missile, I think you're right. I'm sure it's had clarity since that it's ground to ground and ground to air. But either way, it gets clarity at 60 miles because even at that distance, it's absolutely annihilating any geometric obstruction formerly known as the Earth curve.
Yeah, so this laser quote-unquote experiment gets worse.
Okay,
so
go on.
If the standard model of refraction exists, right, or the globe, daydream model of refraction
terrestrial,
exists.
Just call it terrestrial refraction.
Yeah, trashio refraction. Good idea. So this trash refraction, if it was true, in order for this laser within that model to have hit this target in the manner in which it did, they would have had to essentially aim the laser into the sky, if you follow, because they need it to arc, right? You can't just shoot the laser level at the target and hit the target. That would be impossible if the refraction model that they claim existed. They would have had to aim it greater than 45 degrees into the sky. So do you remember back in the day when the FE core laser test came out, one of the Glover's arguments was, well, if you don't level the laser, it wouldn't work. And of course, it was a nonsense argument then, just as much as it's a nonsense argument now.
Excellent.
Yeah, in general,
so
most of the time.
Go ahead.
Go on, Brian.
Just say, general, most of the time when they did them tests, they did another one across Lake Baikal, which is like something like 40 miles, and the laser always ended up bending up the way over there. Maybe it's due to the cold, but the laser ended up bending up the way, not down the way. That was another thing about their tests.
Yeah, so the point in summation is that this model that they dream about fails practical validation in a test in the real world every single time. It never, ever accurately predicts with any form of sequence or repeatability whatsoever. The only times it ever works is by sheer random happenstance. They then cherry pick that data and tell you guys, look, we've proved our proposition because 1 out of 1 billion times it theoretically, within a certain margin, matches our prediction.
Indeed. We used to see it all the time with the Isle of Man debate. People would come along and they'd present their imagery, and by chance they'd present a different image on the same day at a similar time that was from a different camera that didn't happen to line up in the way that the one that they'd cherry-picked was. So I think it was Miles Davis. Anthony caught him out on this. He went up to the top of a hill to catch some imagery of some mountains, and the imagery we got was from some crappy phone camera or a compact camera. And we're like, where's the really good imagery? That just didn't match as well. So the one we got presented was the crappy disposable or whatever camera, because that one was nice enough to be cherry-picked and present his argument in the way he needed. So that's the one that got used. You're like, all right, well, what about the thousands of times that it doesn't match your cherry-picked argument? In any event, with that, I'm going to say, if you are watching this on either Nathan Oakley 1980 or Nathan Oakley premiering streams, then stay tuned, as there will be an after show to follow. A huge, massive, enormous thank you to all of you who smashed the super chat, liked, commented, shared, subscribed, joined as a Nathan Oakley 1980 channel member, and all that good stuff. I think it was Sasha that hit the super chat, so thank you very much indeed for hitting the super chat. Really appreciate your support. Another massive thank you to today's Discord and G+ panels for making today's live show possible. Once again, stay tuned if you're watching on either premiering stream. I've been Nathan Oakley, and I will see you all in the next video.